Everyone, welcome to the National Library of Scotland. My name's Amina Shah. I'm the National Librarian and Chief Exec of the National Library, and it's fantastic to see so many of you here tonight. Thank you so much for coming along. And my colleague Chris is going to give the formal introductions, but I just wanted to say, first of all, how pleased and how lucky we are at the National Library of Scotland tonight in the celebration of Byron's life and letters, that not only do we have amazing collections that we have within the John Murray archive and others within our collections, but we also have amazing people at the National Library, not least all the staff and all the team here, but also our chair, Professor Sir Drummond, that we're so lucky that he's such an amazing person, but also an academic and a Byronist, and understands literature and research, obviously. And he also brings with him amazing connections, which is how we have Andrew here tonight as well. So just wanted to say a big thanks to both of them for coming here. And Andrew's all the way from the States, so it's really fantastic. Thank you both. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amina. So yes, hello and welcome to the National Library of Scotland. My name is Chris Castles and I'm the Head of Archives and Manuscript Collections. So before I start my brief introduction, I'll just quickly run through some housekeeping. So we're not expecting a fire alarm this evening. If the alarm does sound, if you just make your way back out these doors, library staff will be on hand to direct you out onto George IV Bridge. If you have a mobile phone, if you could put that on silent, that would be much appreciated. And finally, as you'll see, we are live streaming tonight's event, so I'd also like to welcome our online audience. With all that said, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers this evening. It's the home of one of the most significant collections of Byron manuscripts in the world, and with this being the month that marks the 200th anniversary of Byron's death, I think it's very appropriate that we are here to talk about Byron, and our two speakers this evening are better placed than anyone to do just that. Professor Andrew Stauffer. Andrew Stauffer is Head of Department of English at the University of Virginia, where he specialises in 19th century British literature, book history and digital humanities. He is the President of the Byron Society of America and has published extensively on the poet, his most recent work being a biography titled Byron, A Life in 10 Letters, published by Cambridge University Press and available in the library's bookshop. And 3 of the letters discussed in the book are held within the library's John Murray archive. Professor Sir Drummond is Chair of the National Library of Scotland Board, a former Byron Journal and Romanticism editor and former Master of Balliol College, Oxford. The second edition of Cambridge Companion to Byron, of which he is the contributing editor, has 6 new chapters, including studies of Byron's manuscripts, his animals, and how his addictive behaviour interacts with his writing. And if anyone's interested in acquiring a copy, a 20% discount is available to attendees of tonight's event. So this evening takes the form of a discussion between these 2 eminent Byron scholars. There will be opportunities to ask questions at the end. So without any further ado, I would like to pass you on to our 2. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Very happy to be here. Thanks for having me and Drummond. We've been talking about Byron a lot this week. There's been a series of events to celebrate the bicentennial of Byron's death. April 19th was the actual day, but there's been a series of events, and so it's great to continue that conversation. And we're here to talk about 2 books, mine and his. And so I thought maybe we would start by talking a bit about the Cambridge Companion to Byron. So mine's a biography, and Drummond's is a kind of survey of the critical landscape, the conversations we're having about Byron, and some of the most significant criticism or commentary on Byron. This is the second edition, 20 years gone since the first, I think. So do you want to start off just by saying what's different from this edition, what's happened in 20 years in Byron studies, and what changed from edition 1 to edition 2?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Yes, it's a great pleasure to continue this conversation, which is now certainly stretched over 2 or 3 weeks. Well, some things are obvious that have changed. I suppose if we think of Byron, first of all, we tend to think of sex. I suppose let's get that on the table first of all, because we can't avoid it. First of all, of course, there was a revolution about Byron's bisexuality and how, in fact, he got claimed, if I can put it that way, by the homosexual community, as the gay community, as as time went by. And then we've got over that, as it were. That's been normalized, if I can put it that way. And then, we had the Me Too movement, and that's raised big question marks, of course, about the way in which Byron behaved to women, and we might talk about that just in a minute or two. So that's one kind of obvious thing, I suppose. But there has also, I think, been a renewed interest, which is very relevant for tonight's discussion, in Byron's manuscripts, both in his letters and in his poetry manuscripts. People are getting more interested in the actual way in which he produced his work. And that whole idea, that it was a volcanic overflow and that he wrote everything just, straight off, as it were, without a single correction, of course, has been long blown out the water. And we'll look at some of the manuscripts there in his letters and in his poetry. He corrects it all the time. And of course, in the letters in particular, he's terribly conscious of audience. Who is he actually sending this letter to? For what audience is a particular poem actually aimed at? What audience is a particular poem aimed? So that sense of the audience changing. And then, last but not least, another thing that's almost become normalized is the idea of addiction. And again, we could talk about sexual addiction, but there's other kinds of addiction. Addiction to writing, for example. And one of the new essays is very much about that. Could Byron actually stop writing? And if you think of somebody who's, 36 years old and 7 volumes of poetry and 13 plus volumes of letters, this chap wrote a lot. So that's there. So we've got new essays on the manuscripts. We've got new essays on sexuality, new essays on writing, and then at the centre of Byron's life too were a lot of his pets and animals. And there's a nice new essay on Byron and animals, both in his life and in his poetry. So that's a quick tour, I think, of the second edition.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that when you did the first edition, presumably some of those essays were written even in the 90s, and so we're really talking about a sea change, or really generational change, in what the ways we talk about Byron, the kinds of questions that are still remain to be asked and answered. And as you say, some of that involves looking at the manuscripts again, going back to the original material. That's why the collection here is so valuable, still visited by Byron scholars all the time. Because you'd think, we know sort of what he wrote, but when you look at these things and your knowledge changes and it deepens. When I set out to write this book, it's 10 letters from across his life, each one telling to a different correspondent in a different phase of his life. But I knew I had to hold the letters in my hands to really do that job appropriately. So I was here a year or so ago looking at some of these letters, and you do see new things each time you look at a letter that you thought you knew in its verbal content. The material thing tells you something else.
Well, the man who wrote the new article in the Companion on the manuscript, on Byron's manuscripts, was for many, many years at Edinburgh University, Tom Mole, and has only recently escaped south of the border to Durham.
Should we could, for an example of what I'm talking about, you can see it even from a distance by comparing 3 and 9. Would that be worth doing now? So you have a handout on your chair, or every other person does, and we can show them online. But even from a distance, the one on my right hand, this is a letter written in 1813 in the midst of a kind of seduction of the lady of the house in Yorkshire, written late at night, a torn postscript that he's sending to Lady Melbourne, gossiping about this incipient seduction. And you can see the torn edge, the crammed in writing. The top says, P.S. second at 10 o'clock. This is the second P.S. to a long gossipy letter that forms the basis of my chapter 3. And then this, by contrast, letter number 9, when he's made the decision to go to Greece on behalf of the London Greek Committee, and it's a very, calmly written and almost administrative sort of letter that he expected to be circulated to the London Greek Committee, in which he is sort of outlining his commitment to the cause. And so just looking at them as documents, you can see that we have different stages of Byron's life and personality, but you really wouldn't be able to tell that if you hadn't looked at the pages. You would just see them as verbal content as opposed to living documents, and we're going to spend probably a little more time on some of these, but yeah.
One of the things we're going to return to, I'm sure, through the evening is that spread of Byron's personality, let's put it that way. He himself said that if he was going to be truthful, he'd have to contradict himself on every page, I'm sure you remember. But that kind of mobility of personality is something we're certainly going to return to.
That's right, and part of the bet of the biography's format was by looking at how he wrote to 10 different correspondents at 10 different periods, you would see different sides of that chameleon-like mobile personality, because of course we all perform slightly different selves for different people, whether it's a family member, a beloved, or a co-worker or something like that. But Byron does so even more intensely, I think, than maybe some of us, and so to see those different sides coming out in the letters.
Of course, the idea of your biography, of Andrew's biography, came out of an edition of Byron's letters, which he was actually working on. So do you want to spend a little time maybe talking about how that one morphed into the other?
Yeah, I was working on an edition of Byron's writings that included a bunch of the letters, and so in editing, I'm editing both the poetry and the letters, I got into his stuff more into his verbal patterns across the course of his life, how the poetry and the letters intersected, and I gained a new appreciation for the quality of the letters, just how great they are to read. He's one of the great letter writers in English. He's probably the great letter writer, I can say that. You can contradict me, but he's one of the top, no question, one of the great letter writers in the English language. But people would often ask me, where do I start? And there's 3,000 surviving letters that we have, as Drummond said, about 12 volumes. And so where do you begin? They're all wonderful, but and what you need is the context for each letter, because just to open a letter and read it, it doesn't tell you that much if it's making a bunch of personal historical references and all of that. All the project morphed, so all that editing morphed into, okay, let's do a greatest, sort of, not greatest hits, but well, I was gonna be a greatest hits. I was like, let's just do the 25 best letters, whatever that was, and just annotate them very extensively. But as I started doing that, I was like, you really need to tell the whole life story, because to understand the salience of a letter written while he's at Cambridge, or while he's in Geneva, or while he's in Italy, or while he's in Greece, you almost have to know everything that he went through and did before he got there to really feel the emotional force and the biographical force of that letter. And so it turned then into a biography with 10 letters as anchor points for 10 episodes and 10 different locations through his what ended up being a short life. If he had lived longer, I'd have to do 12 letters or 14.
We've got across the road there, so to speak, and I hope that some of you have seen it already, but I think there'll be time to look at it afterwards. An exhibition of Mary Shelley's transcripts and Mary Shelley letters about those transcripts. And Mary Shelley represents one of the kinds of relationships that Byron had with women. Lady Blessington, another one. Mm-hmm. And I was very struck at the beginning of your biography by how one of his adolescent friendships with Elizabeth Pigott, for example, how rich that actually seems once you get into the letters.
Yes, yes.
And there were two other people, we were talking about this just before actually, that a woman called Caroline Cameron and a woman called Lucy, whom I don't think we know her surname, who emerged from the darkness in actually reading these letters, in particular your account of the letters. I wonder if you could talk about that.
Partly the trick is not to just tell us about Byron, but to bring out the cast of characters that he worked among. And women were obviously a big part of Byron's life in various different capacities. The Mary Shelley example is interesting, and I class her with the series of, and Elizabeth Pigott is another, of intelligent literary women who took care, in a way, of his literary legacy. They making fair copies, shepherding manuscripts from one place to another. They had a group of, throughout his life, he would turn to women. Mary Shelley is one, Claire Clairmont is another, Teresa Guiccioli is another, Elizabeth Pigott is another, who were co-creators of these documents, that many of which are stored here. So if you go across to the treasures, you can see Mary Shelley's copy of this ode Byron wrote on Venice in 1818, and she's making a careful copy, which then he will go back and correct and then send to the publisher. So she had a hand in his literary publications, just like a lot of those other women do. Elizabeth Pigott basically put together his first collection of poetry and helped him do that.
Sure, well, and that first collection, of course, got him into trouble with the reviewers. And then that got the reviewers into trouble with Byron, as I'm sure you know, in his first big satirical poem, English Bards and Scots Reviewers. He then goes off to Greece for his first trip to Greece, and he encounters a very different kind of culture there, and I mean, we might want to talk about that. But he comes back, he's written Childe Harold, Canto 1 and 2, at least the first two bits, they get published, they're a sensation. And of course, you probably know the story. He woke up one morning and found himself famous. And we go into this period of Byron's life when he is lionized before there's another kind of crisis and things go wrong again in 1816.
Yeah, that's right. We might want to talk about the Greek part, and we might get that towards the end, but it's worth signaling now. You know, Byron's reputation was involved with Greece almost from the beginning. As soon as he came back from that trip and published Childe Harold 1 and 2, he became known as a poet whose work was about the Ottoman-controlled Greece and the Mediterranean. And so Childe Harold 1 and 2 makes his fame, but then the Corsair, the Giaour, the Bride of Abydos, you know, the poems that sort of have a vaguely or set in Ottoman Greece, and so his fame in those years of fame is very much bound up with Greece. But we might want to. Do we want to look at that letter that he? During the years of fame, Byron is catapulted into the highest circles of the aristocracy and begins. Becomes a celebrity in England. It only lasts for a few years before it all goes wrong, and we can talk about that. But he has this several-year period where he is the young lion of literary society and of Whig aristocratic circles as well. And so this letter that in chapter 3 comes out of that period. It's about a year and a half since the publication of Childe Harold.
Yeah, it's October the 8th. Yeah.
October the 8th, 1813, and he is circulating around country houses and balls and various other sort of venues and seducing a lot of people. So that's what this one is about. So this letter, Drummond's going to read a little bit of this letter. He, as I said before, it's number 3, the one that has all the postscripts. Byron is staying in Yorkshire at Aston Hall with his friend, James Webster, and Webster's wife, and he is slowly seducing the wife. Even as he is maintaining fun late-night conversations with Webster, who he slightly despised but slightly, also amused him. And so the letter is written to Lady Melbourne, his correspondent, an older sort of, what would you call Lady Melbourne? The kind of confidant, he called her one of the the queens of high Whiggery. She herself had a scandalous past. She loved to gossip, and she loved to gossip with Byron. And so he would write her these letters in the midst of these seductions and send them off. So what do you want to say? Read a little bit of that.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. This is a very typical Byron letter written to someone he trusts. That trust was not always reciprocated, one has to say, by his confidence. But anyway, here it goes. In these last few days, I've had a good deal of conversation with an amiable person, whom, as we deal in letters and initials only, we will... Francis, of course. Well, these things are dull in detail. Take it once. I have made love. And if I am to believe mere words, for there we have hitherto stopped, it is returned. I must tell you the place of declaration, however, a billiard room. I did not, as Caroline says, kneel in the middle of the room, but like Corporal Trilm to the nun, this is Tristram Shandy he's talking about, I made a speech, which as you might not listen to it with the same patience, I shall not transcribe. We were before on very amiable terms, and I remembered being asked an odd question, how a woman who liked a man could inform him of it when he did not perceive it. I also observed that we went on with our game of billiards, without counting the hazards, and supposed that, as mine certainly were not, the thoughts of the other party were also not exactly occupied by what was our ostensible pursuit. Not quite, though, pretty well satisfied with my progress, I took a very imprudent step with pen and paper. in tender and tolerably turned prose periods, no poetry when in earnest. Here were risks certainly, first how to convey, then how it would be received. It was received, however, and deposited not very far from the heart which I wished it to reach, when who would enter the room but the person who ought at that moment to have been in the Red Sea if Satan had any civility. But she kept her countenance and the paper, and I my composure as well as I could. It was a risk, and all had been lost by failure. But then, recollect, how much more had I to gain by the reception, if not declined, and how much more one always hazards to obtain anything worth having. My BA prospered. It did more. It even, I am this moment interrupted by the marito, and write this before him. He has brought me a political pamphlet in manuscript to decipher and applaud. I shall content myself with the last. Oh, he's gone again. My BA produced an answer, a very unequivocal one, too.
And it goes on, and it goes on through the evening. So there's a PS at 6 o'clock, and then you get this PS at 10 o'clock. So if you want to see the progress of this in-the-moment relationship, you read the whole letter. I'll just read a couple paragraphs that I write so that the chapter begins with that full letter, and then this is what the biography sounds like. It's like something out of a novel or a play, this indiscreet, moment-by-moment letter with James Webster as the overconfident, fatuous husband, Lady Frances as the pale but passionate wife, and Byron as the sly rake, half-ironically pursuing and narrating the business of seduction. Throughout, Byron makes it clear that he feels like he's living in a romantic fiction or erotic farce, comparing himself to literary characters like Corporal Trim, and asking rhetorically, is this not, at this moment, a perfect comedy? He's also clearly stage managing the proceedings, both in this letter and in real life. Not only does he write to his confidant, Lady Melbourne, in ways that amplify the hothouse theatricality of Aston Hall, but Byron also seems to be consciously playing a role among the Websters, doing and saying things in large part that he may write about them to Lady Melbourne. Indeed, like the heroine of Pamela, he writes about some of them while doing them. The double postscripts and interruptions, the marito is talking to me as I write, convey a risky immediacy, and the letter itself unfolds to reveal a second ragged sheet added at the end to contain Byron's rapid-fire, time-stamped updates. It's an immoral, conspiratorial, wildly entertaining letter, one that evokes the spirit of Valmont's correspondent with Madame Mortier in Liaisons Dangereuses, which Byron probably had read by this time. As in that novel, The Dupes, here James Webster and Lady Frances are pawns in a larger game, one extending well beyond billiards and its hazards, and even beyond the seduction of the lady. And to understand the stakes, we need to look back over the previous year and a half of Byron's life. Since the publication of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage in early March 1812, he had moved from the fringes of Regency high society to its center. Suddenly famous, he was attracting gossip, fan mail, reviews, and portraits. His poem had been a smash hit, selling out in a few days and making him a sought-after guest at the balls, routs, formal dinners, and opulent soirees of the leading families of the Whig Party, to whom he gave his political and poetical allegiance. Despite his aristocratic title, Byron had been up to this point, felt himself something of an outsider, born in near poverty, lame, relatively unpolished, a latecomer to the glittering world of the bon ton. Every coterie of privilege has gradations that are only visible from the inside. There's always one more inner circle, and the lines of social rank in the Vanity Fair of Byron's England were very finely drawn. But the fame of Childe Harold propelled his creator like a meteor, and soon Byron, age 24, was socializing with the Prince Regent, visiting the great London homes and country estates of the upper reaches of Whig society, and conducting love affairs with women of distinguished parentage, wealth, and high social position. Many of these women, like Lady Frances, were married already, a fact that may say as much about the sexual conduct of the Regency aristocracy as it does about Byron himself. Particularly among the nobility, marriages were made as alliances of names, property, and money, and adulterous affairs on both sides were frequent and expected. Appearances need to be preserved, and yet predictably, discretion and concealment gave way often enough to make this era one rich in sexual and domestic scandal. And so it goes on from there. So we sort of introduce the letter, and then we have to go back to understand what is happening in Byron's life at this time? How does this fit into the larger game that he's playing? And partly it has to do with his affair with Caroline Lamb and his affair with Augusta Lee, which he's trying to sort of escape from or manically, cure by getting involved with yet another woman with the problematic ones that he's already involved with, and so, yeah.
Well, and of course he references Caroline Lamb in that letter. The Caroline he mentioned in the letter is Caroline Lamb. I mean, so, everything gets terribly mixed up. But one of the interesting things, as you mentioned, is that this dashing prose style, which is both self-reflexive, he makes literary references, he talks about himself writing it. That's really what happens in his late great work, in Beppo and the Vision of Judgment and Don Juan, but he doesn't find that in poetry until we get to about 1818, after the disaster that's about to happen in England. Can you maybe just pick up that bit about him, using one affair to get out of another affair, and what that then terribly leads to?
Well, it eventually leads to him deciding he needs to get married to cure everything, which is really the worst. I'll just find someone who is sort of normal and wealthy and of my own class, and who is sort of calm and morally upright. And Annabella Milbank was all of those things, and they convinced each other, mostly through letters, that they should get married. They were mostly awkward in each other's company in those early days, but the letters, they sort of, and the marriage, of course, didn't work, or it lasted only a year. It produced Ada Lovelace, the daughter, who Byron only knew for a couple weeks before Lady Byron had enough of his increasingly insane behavior, which you can read all about in the book, and many of you know, that she leaves, goes back to her father's house, and he never sees either wife or daughter again. Soon after that, he leaves for the continent.
And some of that is very painful reading in the book, in Andrew's book. Byron is I'm not going to hedge my bets here. Byron is having an affair with his half sister. 20 years ago, or certainly 30 years ago, there was a great deal of controversy about whether he was or wasn't, but I don't think there's really much doubt in that, I'm afraid. He was having an affair, and a love affair it was too. It was very much a love match. But he behaves very badly in his letters to Annabella, sort of taunting her with Augusta and comparing her to Augusta.
He's very cruel behavior. As soon as the marriage happens, the minute they're in the carriage leaving the ceremony, his face changes to this face of cruelty, according to her memory of it. And he says, you never should have married me. You've married a devil. And she, even more insidious, he blames her for turning down his first proposal. He had proposed to her once. She said, no, thank you. Somewhere in there, he begins the erotic affair with his half-sister, and then he proposes again to kind of get out of that, and she says yes. She says, if you had said yes that first time, you would have saved my soul and hers. He has this, they're putting that guilt on her, so it's that kind of, crazy, and it gets worse, and involves physical violence, and a lot of drinking, and spending a lot of time at Drury Lane with actresses and all of that, and just flaunting it and really being cruel to Annabella.
And as you said, he then, this ends in him in scandal, and Byron leaves England never to come back. And we then enter into a kind of crucial period, certainly for his, I think his psychological development, but his poetic, his intellectual development, and more specifically as well, when he's with Shelley in Switzerland, and Byron does a tour of Switzerland. They go out to the lake themselves. They're with Claire Claremont. We'll come to who Claire is in a minute if you don't know who that is. But interestingly, you perceived that period in Switzerland following the scandal and the exile as a period of deep depression for Byron, whereas I've always read it as a period of intense energy. Yes, he was unhappy, clearly, but there was terrific drive. I wonder if you maybe want to...
We've talked about this. There's this hinge of Byron's life. The marriage is a kind of double-jointed hinge. It first brings him towards his only real attempt to be, to join his class and be married and be a regular member of English society. And then it kicks back the other way after the marriage fails, and he goes abroad to Switzerland, and in the one way, that's a place of reinvention for him, as you say. You can feel the energy coming out, and certainly the poetry that he produces, Childe Harold III and Shion and all of that, he's very productive. He talks as if he's depressed in his letters, but he's got a lot of energy, and I think the Shelleys, both having them around, produces this kind of fizzing of creativity and conversation that it's not. And then, so my take was he's depressed in Switzerland, and then he goes to Italy, and he finds a way forward. You know, in Venice is really where he begins to reinvent himself. But there's a way that, and I'm sort of more coming around to your take on it, that actually it's the other way. Rather, Switzerland is this place with Shelley is in creative ferment, and all this is happening. And then he leaves and goes to Venice and embarks on this period of incredible promiscuity in high and low life, and it is possibly a self-destructive, depressive episode rather than I'm going to reinvent myself through hedonism, which is another way of saying it.
Yeah. Well, that's certainly how I read the Venice thing. I mean, this is his period of sexual addiction, as we would now think of it. I mean, he's behaving completely crazily. And I read that as a kind of depressive behavior.
But it's that manic energy that it's hard to know how to read Byron's energy. You know, because when he's energetically doing things like going to balls and staying up late writing poetry and having all these affairs, is he doing that to try to escape? Because he's so restless, he can't be alone with himself. Or is that a sign that he's back? You know, and Venice is a bit of that. He's like, he'll be like, oh, I had a sex in the morning, and then I swam 4 miles in the canal, and then I have another date tonight, and tomorrow I'm going to arrange. He's just moving from one thing to another, and it's hard to know whether that's coming from a place of ebullience or a place of like, I can't be alone in a room. I need to, be, filling my brain and body with a sensation.
And of course, this is the point at which he begins to find what certainly now in the 21st century we think of as his real poetic voice when he starts to write about Venice. The big thing, along with Childe Harold III in Switzerland, is his drama, mental theatre, as he called it. He didn't really intend it to be produced. His answer to Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, Manfred. This is the great rejection of authority, not only human authority, but divine authority as well. This key moment where, unlike in Faust, either Marlowe's or Goethe's, the devils are just sent off stage when Manfred says, well, you're irrelevant. You have nothing to do with me. Yeah. And there's a kind of key moment, really.
I'm my own destroyer. I will destroy myself. And there's that kind of claiming his own, I'm my own torturer. There's nothing you can bring to the table that I haven't already done to myself, and that posture of defiance. Yeah, and that's the poem that when he turns it in, when he gives it to Murray, he's like, here it is. I feel like maybe I've gone as far as I can go with melancholy, defiant heroes, the Byronic hero. I need to change. And it's soon after that he begins doing Beppo and the more Italian, the sense of humor. Although maybe we want to read that early poem, because we were making a kind of schematic case that there's early Byron and late. Everything before, say, 1817 is this, a lot of it is this kind of dark, Byronic, brooding, melancholy, tortured, or entertaining, but light verse. But the big thing, but the humor of Byron is there from the beginning. It doesn't take to Italy to find it. His early lyrics are full of high spirits and fun as well. So it's not as simple as early, dark, brooding, late, Don Juan-esque and fun and farcical. So we thought Drummond might read a poem from the early period.
Yeah, this I really only noticed that for the first time, or noticed the significance of it from Andrew's book. So it's about Byron swimming the Hellespont. Everybody knows he swam the Hellespont, of course. So he's mirroring Hero and Leander. If in the month of dark December, Leander, who was nightly wont, what maid will not the tale remember, to cross thy stream, broad Hellespont? If when the wintry tempest roared, he sped to Hero, nothing loath, and thus of old thy current poured, fair Venus, how I pity both. For me, degenerate modern wretch, though in the genial month of May, my drooping limbs I faintly stretch, and think I've done a feat today. But since he crossed the rapid tide, according to the doubtful story, to woo, and Lord knows what beside, and swam for love, as I for glory, 'twere hard to say who fared the best. Sad mortals, thus the gods still plague you. He lost his labour, I my jest, for he was drowned, and I've the ague. So plague you, ague, story, glory, etc. These double rhymes are exactly, of course, what we find in the Ottava Rima of Beppo and Don Juan. So he's playing games already.
And that irony, self-ironizing, but also that interruptive, to woo and Lord knows what beside. Like, oh, I'm not going to nudge, I won't mention it, but that self-interruptive, arch self-censoring, that happens in Don Juan all the time. So this is 1810. So that part of his poetic DNA was always in there, and it really finds full flower when he moves to Italy, moves to Venice, and spends time traveling around Italy, and begins incorporating Ottava Rima into his style, which happens right around this time with Beppo and
Yeah, well, the letter, the Epistle to Augusta, significantly, I think, is the first serious poem in Ottava Rima, and here it's a letter to Augusta, nonetheless.
Now that you say that, I should have made that one of the chapters. Because it is an epistle to Augusta. I mean, it's not an official letter, but that's what he calls it. So, yeah, I could have cheated and put that in there, but yeah.
Yeah, and it's an important moment when he's defying everybody in Manfred. He's borrowing bits and pieces from Milton. I mean, quotations from Milton, but then he's got to find a voice of his own. And the Italian author Pulci rides to the rescue, as it were. And an Englishman who Byron actually meets in Venice, who writes Whistlecraft, Frere, who writes Whistlecraft, so that he gets a bit of English model, but mainly an Italian model. And he had to kind of accommodate to all kinds of, different mores in Italy as well, which feed onto into the poetry. The whole business about the Guiccioli affair, it's a real lesson in social history.
Yeah, he becomes sort of part of a complicated Italian family through this affair with Teresa Guiccioli, the 19-year-old Contessa that he meets, who's married, of course, to a 56-year-old man. She's married off, sort of as she was never in love with her husband, and she was looking around for a lover. You were permitted to have one lover as an Italian aristocrat, a cavalier servente who would be, come with you and be your male companion. And Byron was auditioning for that job in Venice and essentially got it, but he wasn't really comfortable with it. He wasn't sure and so it took a while for them to work out exactly the terms of their relationship, which eventually ended up with a separation between her and her husband. Byron didn't just want to play the sort of fan-carrying lover. He wanted more of Teresa's attention, more of her time, and installs herself in the family home, installs himself in the Guiccioli palazzo, and just lives there, having an affair with the wife, and meanwhile the husband is, I don't know what he's doing, having affairs of his own. So it's a complicated sexual economy that Byron gets involved with, but it's also a political one, because the Gamba family, Teresa's family, are very much interested in the cause of Italian nationalism, very involved with sort of rebellion against the Austrians, and Byron gets brought into that, drawing on the same sort of sympathies that will soon get him involved with the Greek cause as well. So he starts off working for the Carbonari, assembling guns, going to meetings, but that revolution falls apart pretty quickly, and he begins looking towards Greece.
It's very strange that he, as Andrew says, he's keeping guns. He's storing guns in the basement of their house. But the Austrian secret police are onto him. But all the secret police records I've read are actually about the women coming and going to the house. None of them seem to notice that there are arms in the basement and that Byron's servants are running messages for the Carbonari. I mean, it's very strange. It's not desperately efficient.
It was a complicated scene. I think he often didn't know what was happening. Doing his best to sort of figure it out.
And part of this Italian episode, of course, takes place in Pisa, and again, you dramatize very nicely in the book that this, utter disaster that was the time that Byron stayed in Pisa. It's not just one thing that goes wrong. Everything goes wrong.
Everything goes wrong, and Shelley's death is kind of at the heart of it, but the death of his own daughter Allegra, his natural daughter Allegra, that Claire Claremont had, he had been taking care of her irregularly. She was then now in a convent school, and she died of a sickness there, and so that death, which he felt feel strongly, even though he hadn't paid a lot of attention to her. He didn't expect that Allegra was going to die, and then Shelley dies soon thereafter. They get in that argument with the trooper, Massey. It's just sort of bad vibes and bad things that happen in Pisa and kind of ruin friendships in a way, or end things between, say, Leigh Hunt and Byron, the Hunts, and Murray in a way. I mean, the relationship with Murray falls apart. Byron's still publishing with the Hunts, but the Leigh Hunt relationship isn't good. So, yeah.
So that sense of ending things, I think, is you can kind of feel it in Byron as we get towards the end of his Italian period, that even the relationship with Teresa, which has gone on for a long while, and which Teresa felt very keen about. I mean, it dominated the rest of Teresa's life, it would be fair to say, I think. But you do get a kind of sense of, I don't know whether it's weariness or something ending.
Well, his health really never recovered. When they're burning Shelley's body on the beach, and Byron doesn't really want to watch this for very long, and so he goes off to swim out to the boulevard, to his yacht that's out in the water, and he stays out in the sun for hours and gets this terrible case of sun poisoning, and all his skin peels off. And months later, almost like a year later, he's still writing in letters to friends. And Byron was not one to complain really about his health. He was actually had pretty stiff upper lip. He said, "I've never felt the same since that stupid swim on the day of Shelley's." And he starts having convulsions, seizures, strange mental episodes where he throws furniture and tears his clothes. There's something going on, and his energy is much diminished. So there's a way that you feel like he's looking for endgame at a certain point, whether consciously or not. And he does believe in the Greek cause, and I think he had some belief that by going back to Greece, the scene of his youthful triumphs, in a sense, when he's writing Childe Harold for the first time, he's having his first fully satisfying love affair with a man. He's young, strong, bronzed, fit, all of that. He wants to go back in time, and so he goes back in place, and he's also going because Shelley was such a believer in the Greek Revolution. And when Shelley dies, he sort of takes up the mantle and finds himself drawn into the Greek Revolution. Had been declared in 21. Byron had been too busy with Ravenna and Pisa and all of that to really pay much attention. But Shelley had been paying attention. And then when Shelley dies, Byron's galvanized. His friends Hobhouse and Kinnaird have started the London Greek Committee, and they ask him, could you help us? Could you use your money, your talent, your influence to influence the Greek cause?
And when he arrives in Greece, of course, what he discovers is chaos, is incipient civil war, as well as war against the Turks. Yeah. And one of the takes us back to that letter that's written in an almost kind of bureaucratic hand, isn't it?
Yes, number 9. Yeah.
He became a terrific organizer.
And he really wrote almost no poetry once he went to Greece. Very little. He sort of stops being a poet, stops being a lover, and becomes a man of war, whatever that means. He doesn't fire a shot or strike a blow, but he's menaced by Turkish ships. He's arranging for guns. He's arranging for supplies, medical supplies. He's doing a lot of negotiating with prisoners and doing a lot of humanitarian work, giving money to refugees, supporting families in the
on both sides.
On both sides.
On
yeah,
both sides,
right.
on both the Greek and the Turkish side. I think that's again, that comes out very nicely in your book. I mean, personally, I don't know if there is anybody else, but I discovered Byron was a hero in both Greece and Turkey, and there can't be many people who actually.
Yes.
But that's more about his support of Islam against Christian prejudice than it is about his humanitarian aid. But nevertheless, that's very noticeable.
That's right. He had sympathetic things to say for all sorts of across many cultures and peoples. And when he spent time in the Ottoman Greece was a complicated place. There were a lot of different ethnic groups, a lot of different sort of proto-national groups. But he was able to connect with all of them in one way or another. Even as he put his money and resources on the side of Greek independence, he had nice things to say about Turks as well, or at least he also had mean things to say about the Greeks. So he sort of even-handed in his way. I thought I might read a few paragraphs from the last chapter.
Please.
Because we want to take questions in a little bit, but I won't read long. I'm not going to read the end, but just a couple paragraphs that sort of set the scene. Byron first goes to Kefalonia and spends some time there kind of sussing out the situation. Where should I go in Greece? How should I make a difference? And it eventually becomes clear that he should go to Mesolongi, which is a kind of becoming a provisional seat of government. Part of the problem is there's all these local power brokers and warlords in Greece jockeying for attention and power as the Ottoman situation becomes more unstable. And so Byron goes to Mesolongi, and it's a fascinating story about how he gets there, but in any case, he's here now. And this is the 10th letter. I won't read it, but he's writing it in February 25th, so he's been in Mesolongi for a month or two, and he's going to die in April. He doesn't know that yet, but the letter does mention an attack he's had, a kind of apoplexy, which is feeling apocalyptic because there's also a big earthquake that happens. Well, anyway, he's had some health problems. Anyway, so I'll just read a couple paragraphs from the book, and then we can maybe take some questions. Like Venice, Mesolongi is a place made of water. It nestles beside a broad lagoon stretching from the Acoluos River delta to the Gulf of Patras. And in Byron's era, the streets were essentially canalized. Small flat-bottomed boats glided up to the very doors of buildings encircled by the town's muddy entrenchments. Byron observed ruefully, the dikes of Holland when broken down are the deserts of Arabia for dryness in comparison. And he speculated, if we're not taken off with the sword, we are likely to march off with the ague, there it is again, in this mud basket, dying martially rather than martially. From the upper window of the two-story Capsalis house, which fronted the lagoon, Byron could gaze out through the rain at the gray-bound Acarnanian mountains in the distance and watch herons and flamingos fishing in the shallow water. The walls of his sitting room were hung with rifles, pistols, swords, dirks, helmets, and other instruments of war, and the desk was strewn with maps and letters. His dog, Lion, a large Newfoundland retriever given to him in Genoa, sprawled on the floor, paws muddy. Byron had arrived in winter, the chilly, wet season that may have reminded him of the weather of his childhood in Scotland. He took to wearing a large tartan cloak to keep off the cold. As Byron became more involved with the Greek Revolution, he sometimes saw himself as a character in a Walter Scott novel, perhaps the worthy scion of his warlike Scottish ancestors on his mother's side, the Gordons of Geit. Just before embarking for Mesolongi, he had stayed up all night eagerly finishing Quentin Durward, Scott's latest tale of military heroism, writing at the same time of his decision to support the Greeks using a phrase from Red Gauntlet, David Maclay's favorite novel. I shall cast in my lot with the pure hill folk. Aboard ship, Byron's doctor had noticed the poet rolling his R's, pronouncing Corinth with a Scottish accent. And once on the mainland, Byron began operating like something like a Highland chief, maintaining a company. He called them a clan or a sept or a tribe or horde of 500 Suliot Albanian soldiers, having admired their rough appearance and brave masculinity since his first visit to Albania and Greece in 1809. To Pietro Gamba, that's Teresa's brother, he remarked, "Our wild troops here, which remind me of what our Highlanders must have been, are more in my way, at least as a poet. In their Albanian kirtles, with belts bristling with weapons, his Suliot troops looked almost like Scottish clansmen lounging in the courtyard as the rain fell on Mesolongi." And we go on from there. So I wanted to read that bit because of National Library of Scotland, but there is a sense that Byron's kind of re-embracing his Scottish upbringing as it spends a bit of his childhood there until the age of 10.
There's a kind of double circularity there. He goes back to Greece, but he's also writing about Scotland, about his time in Aberdeen. One of the stranger moments at one of the conferences that Andrew and I were at recently was when somebody asked Andrew how he knew that lions' paws were muddy.
Well, you know, that does speak to how you write a biography because you want to give visuals, right? But we don't have any photos or movies of this. But we know it was muddy. We know it rained all the time. No one's wiping that dog's paws off every time it comes in and out of the house. Byron had lots of animals and he loved his animals. There's a great anecdote that's in here that Byron, when he was feeling harassed by all of the people who wanted his money and he didn't know who to trust, he would turn to Lion and say, "Thou art no rogue, Lion. You know, you're a good dog. You would never betray me." And Lion sweeps the floor with his tail and barks. And because James Perry records that anecdote, so we do have certain vignettes that people recorded of him with the dog, who were apparently inside. Actually, there's a picture in the book of him with the dog too. I don't know if I'm going to hold that up, but I'll try. If we have it right here, yeah, you can't really see it, but there he is. Wearing his cloak, and there's Lion looking up at him faithfully. So, yeah.
So let's hope, anyway, we're going to pass over to you for questions. Chris is going to come up and help us. And let's hope that the questions perhaps range a little more deeply than how did Andrew know that Lion's paws were.
We've got just under 10 minutes. There's a roving microphone. If you would like to ask a question, if you just raise your hand and wait for the microphone to come to you and then speak. So we can start with the person in the back. In the striped top.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for this great discussion. I wanted to know a little bit more how you went about choosing the 10 letters. And also, if I may, could you tell us a little bit more about Byron's time in Venice, and particularly in San Lazzaro, where I believe he was with the Armenian Mechidarist order learning Armenian?
That's right, yes.
Could you put that into context for us? Thank you.
Yes, yeah, thanks. Two good questions. Just quickly, in terms of choosing the letters, I knew I needed ones to different correspondents in different locations and to cover the period of his life. So I read as many of the letters as I could, and I've been studying Byron for like 20 years, so a lot of them were familiar in bits. I wanted it to be a good letter in its own right, that is readable, and because the whole thing is, each chapter begins with the whole letter, so it had to be good. It had to represent a kind of stage or hinge or moment in his life. It had to be a different correspondent, a different location, and it had to do a certain biographical work while also being a good letter. Byron has many good letters, and you could pick 10 really interesting ones, but they would all cluster at certain periods, and I wanted it to give a wide range. And so that was, and I did swap some out as I wrote it. As I went along, I realized, no, I need letter 6 to get him from X to Y. I can't keep him in Venice. I've got to get him to the next city where I'm going to run out of room, and so there was some negotiation. In terms of the Armenian convent, or the Armenian monastery, yes, Byron, he was in the midst of this period of sexual promiscuity and having affairs. It was Venetian carnival and the spirit of license, and he said his brain needed something craggy to break upon, some contrast, and so he would go out and try to learn Armenian with the monks out there, and he did end up producing some publications in Armenian, although his Armenian teacher said that he was a hothead, and he really was more interested in fun than study. But he did love languages and other cultures, and it's just a kind of an amazing thing that he would have the time and energy in the midst of this incredible social whirl that he's involved with, and writing all the poetry that he's writing. He's like, I think I'll learn Armenian, like it's an impossible language, and produce a grammar and some translations and things like that. Yeah.
And of course wrote fluently in Italian, and indeed in Venetian dialect. I mean, his Italian wasn't always correct, but he had what's the word, internalized it enough to actually be able to use Venetian dialect comically in the context of Italian.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? The gentleman.
Andrew.
Hello, good to see you.
We are Byron Rudy, for two of them. I remember he's from writing checks and everything 20 years ago. Anyway, it's not about me. Every good book, usually there's 90% of all your work left out of it. So I'm speaking to you as pedagogue, insofar as you're speaking to half of us all here that are the converted. So what I'm really interested in is the next generation coming on. What is the utility of a good book? In other words, have you got half a dozen themes to take on from there that your students in Massachusetts and North America, Northeast, will be getting on with it? You've lightly touched here. Have you got work in progress in hand for the next generation's books about it all? Because it's like fully Shakespeare, a man for all seasons, but what's the next season?
Well, thank you. I mean, this book was written with a pedagogical aim, in a sense, broadly speaking. I wanted to tell the story of Byron and introduce people to the letters who maybe were coming to him fresh. And so I didn't want to, it's the kind of book I could give to my students, which I felt the lack of when I would teach Byron. I'm like, well, you need to know the life. Well, where should we learn it? Well, either give them the 600-page Fiona McCarthy or the 1,000-page Marchand, or they go to Wikipedia. There's other ones, but there's not, and also this gave a taste of the letters, and so this was an attempt to give a story, a resource to my students, and not just my students who are in my class, but readers out there, general readers who want to get into Byron but don't really know where to start, but have a dim sense that the life is kind of where it's at. You need to know the life. You can't just sort of start reading the poetry. You could, but the younger generation may not, unless they've already been hooked on the personality.
The life of the poet. Imagine the
Yes, yes. You need you need all the poets. That's a common, but Byron is particularly true because so much of the poetry is just sort of impacted or torqued by what he's going through, or directly involved with what he's going through.
Sure, absolutely. I have to make a pitch. There's a very slim volume in the Writers and Their Work series on Byron, written by somebody not a million miles away from here. And it is still in print, and
Yes.
it's about 120 pages. Anyway, there you go.
Yes, yeah, that's a competitor. No, that one is good. That one is good, but that one doesn't have the actual letter. You know,
No,
this
it
one.
doesn't.
So I wanted to
No, it
almost be a
doesn't.
mixture of anthology and biography, so you could kind of see how the life and work are intertwined.
Sure.
I think we've got time for one more question.
Somebody at the back there, I can see.
The person at the back.
Very back.
If you just keep your hand up until the microphone comes. Okay.
Thanks so much. Byron's work in the past has inspired a lot of music, so I was wondering if you'd thought, as part of the centenary year, whether the National Library could work with something like the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland to either commission a piece of music, either a setting of the poem, or just a general reaction to Byron's life.
Well, there is a new piece of music which has been composed by Judith Weir. And those of us who were at Trinity, Cambridge on the day had the privilege of hearing it. So we should definitely bring that to the National Library. And one of the things we didn't talk about was the original setting, of course, of Hebrew melodies, which again done, of course, by the Jewish composer Isaac Nathan. And we didn't get into that side of Byron, but that was deeply scandalous at the time. I mean, that they actually collaborate with Nathan.
He had a period of songwriting that was connected to his friendship with Thomas More, who was, of course, doing Irish melodies, and there was sort of a national song, sort of craze around that time. And so Hebrew melodies was Byron's, Irish melodies, and those kind of nationalistic songs that are part of the Romantic period.
There's a fabulous setting of Son of the Sleepless by Hugo Wolf, and I recommend people to go to that because it tells you a lot about the poem as well as being just a wonderful piece of music. Leave aside all the other things by Tchaikovsky and Schumann, etc.
Yeah, that's right. And your question sort of points to that the large cultural influence that Byron has goes beyond poetry. It's really across Europe, cross media, cross artistic forms. The Byronic becomes this adjective to describe a lot of different things, and he inspires poets and novelists and painters and
Caspar David Friedrich, Angelico, and so forth and so on. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. The first time Nietzsche uses the word Übermensch is in an essay he wrote on Marino Faliero, one of Byron's plays, and he's just a young student. Nietzsche is at the time. But there's a way that the Byronic gets into the groundwater of European thinking and never really leaves it. We may not recognize it as much now because it's gone through so many forms, but it's a huge influence across Europe and really across the world. We're going to meet the International Association of Byron Society conference is in Greece this summer. Naturally, we'll be in Mesolongi, and there'll be representatives from 20 different nations there, where there are societies that care about Byron.
Are you drawing us to a close there?
Yes, I'm very sorry to say that I'm afraid we have run out of time, but thank you very much to everyone here and to our online audience for attending this evening. For the people in the room, do please go and look at the exhibition and treasures and peruse the shop. But I think the only thing that remains is for us to say thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you.
And Andrew and I would like to say thank you to the National Library of Scotland too. I know that both for this evening and for everybody who's actually been involved here, Chris and Claire and the rest of the team. But to the library as an organisation, I mean, I thank you very much for curating the Murray Archive and the other Byron material that we have.
I couldn't have done this work without the support of the National Library of Scotland. It's so crucial for the book. So thank you all, and thank you all for this evening. Thank you, Drummond.